South Carolina are just stunning. And I couldn't find them in the paper. And I would ask, why didn't you write about this particular person? Or why didn't you write about this particular event? And these older white guys would just sort of look at me, you know. They didn't have a good answer, and they probably weren't pleased that I was asking. And I should probably add that this is a time when there are very few women still in newspapers at all. So I started paying attention to who I wanted to be as a reporter, and part of the answer to that is I wanted to write the stories that weren't in the paper. And for me, this was gargantuan because this was still great white men territory, newspapers were. And so that meant that I was writing about everybody else. It was an enormous portfolio. I'm writing about women, I'm writing about minorities, I'm writing about poor people, I'm writing about children, I'm writing about everybody else. And so as I did well and I won awards, they were kind of puzzled that I didn't want to go over what they thought was the plum job, which is the state legislature. But those are exactly the people that I didn't want to write about. And so as I moved along through my career, it occurred to me that because of this inside-outside ability I had, that I was probably ideal person to be looking at the past of South Carolina and writing about the people who had been left out of the story. And so I started making a real point of, for example, Black History Month or Women's History Month, of trying to do big, what newspapers call packages. So that's a little about how I came into contact with many of the wonderful people that are in this book, or with their children or even their grandchildren, or hunted what few papers there are in archives about them. And began building, strength as someone who was understanding these stories. So why would elderly Black people tell me their stories? I had a good reputation by this point in time, being accurate and fair and really interested. I'm someone with a wide open heart. I don't have any ego about this. I didn't need to own their stories. I wanted to honor their stories and pass them on. And that was apparent. And one of the things reporters learn is that if you find one person, you can probably find 100, because one person leads to another person. And so at somewhere along the way, a USC Press editor said, this should be a book. You know more about this than probably anybody else in the state. And I thought, ha ha ha, book. I have 2 children. I'm a single parent. I'm working full time at a demanding job. Sure, it should be a book. But then somewhere else along the way, I thought, yes, it does need to be a book. And these stories need to be not only gathered and in newspapers, but collected in a more permanent form. So that's how Stories of Struggle came into being. And so now I want to invite you to see some of the people I'm going to talk about. So this is Reverend James Hinton, and this picture was taken in the early 1940s. He was one of a few hundred Black men who were officers, infantry officers in World War I. He had been born in North Carolina, but grew up in New York City because he was orphaned at 4 years old, and an aunt in New York took him in. He went to a Bible college and then into World War I, and Augusta had the area around Augusta had several military bases, training camps, things like that. And he mustered out in Augusta. And at that point in time, there was a Black-owned insurance company, Pilgrim Health and Life, and they hired him. He started traveling the South and the West, and then came back to Augusta as the home base and made his base Columbia in 1939, and immediately became president of the Columbia NAACP. And he is just the most amazing human being that I think I have ever encountered. He's a movie star, really. He was blunt. He was kidnapped, abducted by the KKK. And the way he told the story, he was tied to a tree. He probably would have been murdered, except they had their car lights on with the headlights on to see him as they beat him with chains. And their radios announced that people were looking for Reverend Hinton because he had been pulled out of his boarding house in Augusta, and white and Black people had seen him being pushed into a car and had reported it to the police. And when they knew that they were being looked for, they left, they untied him and left. And his comment about it was, I would rather die than live on my knees. And that was the choice that he made every day. And he was, the cliche, truth to power. He was a man who spoke that. So as we go along, I'm going to mention all the ways that white supremacy was safeguarded by the legislature and the governor. And at a certain point, there was what was called the white supremacy session, which had to do with voting rights. And there was a lot of railing in the couple of days when they're eliminating every right to vote about how Black men only wanted to abduct and sexually assault white women. And he wrote this scathing letter to the legislators that were speaking about this and said it was absolutely the reverse, that if you looked at Black people and you saw the color of their skin, you would know that it was white men assaulting Black women. Otherwise, they would all be Black. So think of saying that in the early 1940s. Those are the sort of things that would get you killed. And besides being abducted and almost murdered, his house was shot into with powerful enough bullets that they went through the wall and into furniture. But he never quit. You can see this, I think, in his eyes. You can see that he has this direct, I'm gonna tell you the way it is, look to himself. He had 3 children. He commuted between Augusta and Columbia. His wife died in the childbirth of his youngest child, and he married a few years later. But his children, I talked to 2 of his children about him, and one of them said about the abduction, she said, he went to work the next day. He just went on. That's the man that he was. Now he gathered around him a group, oh dear, let me see. Sometimes I have problems with it moving along. There we go. He gathered around him a group of people that were fervid and strong in their beliefs and therefore like him. This is Levi Byrd. And Hinton initially didn't want to be state conference president, which is what he became in 1941 and served till 1958, because he thought that would weaken the Columbia branch to also have a state conference branch. This is Levi Byrd. He grew up in both North Carolina and South Carolina. He didn't get any schooling. He's a very eloquent man. And he moved to Schraw, and in the early 30s, Dizzy Gillespie was building his band, and the trumpeter was murdered by white men. And Levi Byrd was trying to investigate and was almost beaten to death himself. Now, he had been a railroad car laborer where he loaded railroad cars. And he said that before he came to Schraw, he had seen, this is, think that right after the Depression, and they're what were called hobos writing. He had seen writing on the railroad car where on one side it said, what do you want your life to be? And on the other side, it said, your life will be what you make it. And he had carried that into his life. And he decided what he was going to make of his life after this beating was that he was going to make sure that Black people gathered together to protect themselves. And so he was the one that pushed for the state conference, because he felt that if NAACP branches then banded together, then Black people would be coalescing and having some power about their lives. And he was the corresponding secretary for the ensuing state conference. And as I said, he was what we sometimes call unlettered. He had not been to school, but he would type these beautiful letters. For example, he said the reason that he wanted an NAACP was he wanted to fight the brutal way they're doing our race. And when Hinton's home was shot into, he said, well, as long as there's some others and me with our 9 lives, the NAACP will continue. So one of the ways you can track him is he probably wrote at least once a week to the national NAACP office. And as I said, the letters are just beautiful. And I think you can see some of the wry smile. And that's a word I often thought of with some of these heroes, is they managed to have, I don't know that I'd call it a sense of humor, but a sense of not taking themselves so seriously in terms of because they were willing to give up their lives, and also having some ability to say, well, that was bad, but tomorrow's going to be better, to sort of balance and smile at horrible things. I think you can see that in him. This is Majeska Simpkins, who many of you have probably heard of. Her house has been preserved. We're talking here about the 1940s, and so there aren't a lot of women who have power in these early stories. But she was one with power, and she was another very blunt person. And then a fourth person I'm going to show you, Hinton, John McCrae, and Majeska Simpkins. They sort of spoke as one voice sometimes. She was corresponding secretary for the state conference. And McCrae, who we'll meet in just a second, and she ran a Black-owned newspaper. And so she also had a radio show. And she was not entirely popular because she just truly, like the others, would say almost anything. And she was educated. She had gone to Benedict College. She taught, and then she became part of the Tuberculosis Association. Tuberculosis and third world diseases were just endemic in South Carolina in the 40s. And because of her NAACP affiliation, she got fired. And she said that she would rather know someone had died of TB and gone to hell than neglect to have an impact on how her people were being treated. So she was comfortable with making the choice that it was the NAACP, although not comfortable, of course, with losing her job. I don't mean to say that. So fourth person, John McCrae. As a newswoman, I love this newsman look here. He's got his pens in his pockets. In case one pen runs out of ink, he's got another pen, and his hat. Think about those 1940s, press people. He also had a college education. He went to Talladega, and I'm making a point of this because at this point in time, the average amount of years of education of a white or Black South Carolinian is elementary school. It's about 5th or 6th grade for white people and about 3rd or 4th grade for Black people. And he was working for a newspaper in Charleston, combined that with another newspaper, and that became the Lighthouse Informer, and then he brought it to Columbia because of the powerhouse that was being built by Hinton. He, in terms of speaking truth to power, he wrote a story at one point in the 50s where he was accused of criminal libel. He had written, a white reporter had written the same story. It was about a sexual liaison between a white woman and a Black man. And the white father was appalled that this was consensual and was trying to charge anyone who said it was not a rape with the end of their lives. He was put into a chain gang camp, and the white reporter was not punished at all. So another thing you're going to hear over and over again is this impossible task of trying to get equal justice. But here they are, this sort of what we call now the dream team, who are born in, most of them except for McCrae, are born in the 1890s and have this vision. They have probably known people who were enslaved as well as people during Reconstruction, or have heard intimate family stories, and yet they have the courage to go ahead with the many things that Hinton decides needs to be done. And that includes equal teacher pay. At this point in time, I'm going to show you a picture later of schools, but at this point in time, white people are keeping all the tax money. They don't feel any obligation to share the tax money with Black people. And so most Black schools in rural areas are shanties, abandoned houses, hunting lodges, without heat, without water, without electricity. And this is going to have an enormous impact on children's lives. And the teachers are getting salaries that are 1/3 of white teachers, and they're having 10 times more students. I'm not exaggerating here. So a white teacher has a brick school with a playground, cafeteria, electricity, water fountains, toilets, and she's teaching 20 to 30 at the very most children and getting about $1,200. a year. Remember, this is the early 40s. And a Black teacher may be teaching all grades. She may be teaching 70 students. I'm not exaggerating again. And she's getting about $400 a year. So Hinton gathers the forces and they sue for equal teacher pay, and they win. What happens is they lose 3 petitioners along the way who were run out of the state, but they keep suing. It's 2 women and then a man. And they win that lawsuit. But what Hinton really wants to do is he wants to sue for the vote. And at this point in time, there is what's called the all-white primary. And I do mean all-white primary. This is Osceola McCain, and this is going to become his specialty. He was another Black officer during World War I who stayed in Belgium after briefly coming back to the United States and running a socialist newspaper in New York. In 1919, there was what was called the Red Summer, where Black soldiers were coming back. And now, again, it's just hundreds. But white people are so appalled at Black soldiers coming back and thinking that they have some citizenship rights after risking their lives, that Red Summer occurs. And this is where, with impunity in major cities, white people riot, burn down houses, and murder hundreds of Black people. So he went back to Europe after that, and he ran a club called Max Place in Ghent, Belgium. And he stayed there until the early 40s and then came back to South Carolina. He'd grown up in Sumter, and he had been the founder of the Sumter NAACP, and he started working on voting rights and was very important in both the teacher pay lawsuit and in helping Hinton organize for trying to get voting rights. So what happened to help this crew is that there was an effort by the NAACP to sue state by state for voting rights. But before we get to that story, I want you to think about race in South Carolina. So this is a picture by my friend Cecil Williams, and it is a picture of his neighborhood. And his neighborhood is all Black. And all these children, see these blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids? All these children are, in South Carolina terms, of 1 drop of blood Black. And this is going to affect all their lives in terms of the opportunities they have, the education they have, who they may marry. This is Cecil, and this is his best friend, Leroy Sultan, who throughout his life is going to be very active in the NAACP and also look completely white. And he said Cecil is Native American and Black and white in his heritage. And he said there was a lot of conversation at his dinner table about both politics and race. And part of the topic of conversation was people leaving town to pass. And by pass, that means that you go on to have a life as a white person. So these are the children that people like Hinton are fighting for. And before we get to how they do get the vote, I have a couple of upsetting pictures here, and I want you to think about how incredibly dangerous it is. So this is Isaac Woodard, and he's a World War II veteran. And he's riding a bus from Augusta, where he's mustered out, to Winsboro. And these are buses that don't have restrooms. And he's with a bunch of veterans who've mustered out from Augusta. And he asks the bus driver to stop so he can go to the bathroom. The bus driver won't stop. Bus drivers were like police officers. They were treated as police officers. They could arrest people. They could assault people with impunity, and did. That's why you have Rosa Parks later, and I'm going to tell you about a South Carolinian who has an even more effective bus drive than Rosa Parks. So at a certain point, he goes up and he says something along the lines of, "Damn it, I am a man like you, treat me like a man." And the bus driver pulls into Batesburg, Leesville, gets out, gets the police chief and the police officer, tells them that Isaac Woodard is drunk and abusive. Isaac Woodard gets off to prove that he's not drunk. He has not been drinking. He's assaulted by the police officer, who uses a bludgeon and gouges out his eyes. Now, Hinton pursued all of these things, and he finds out later, because what happens when Isaac Woodard comes to blind, they take all his money, the police officers, as a fine for him being supposedly drunk, and drive him to the Veterans Hospital and leave him there. And so the talk begins, but they have a difficult time finding Isaac Woodard, who goes on from the Veterans Hospital, where they tell him that he is blind forever and there's nothing they can do for him, to New York. In the midst of Hinton searching for Isaac Woodard, Orson Welles hears the story, the famous actor and director, and he starts radio shows on this, which you can hear on archive.org, saying, "We are going to find you, Mr. Police Chief. We're going to find you. You can't do this to American veterans." And he is found, and he is encouraged by the NAACP to be witness, and the police chief, whose name is Linwood Shull, is charged with the assault on him. However, the way he's charged, because South Carolina won't take him to trial, is the federal government charges under a civil rights law at that time that says he has the right not to be tortured or battered. And so that's what goes to court. And in 28 minutes, an all-white male jury acquits Linwood Shull. This becomes an international incident, and there is an enormous fundraiser where Billie Holiday and Woody Guthrie and Joe Louis, who's the world weight champion, all gather together to raise some money for Isaac Woodard. He's cautious with this money. He buys an apartment building, a nephew collects the rent, and he lives the rest of his life in New York with, he doesn't get his veteran pay, with some income from the fundraiser. So this is George Elmore. So keeping that in mind, keeping how people can be harmed just for saying, I'm a man, and I want to go to the bathroom, how they can be harmed. George Elmore is the one that does the voting rights lawsuit. So Smith versus All Right is a Texas lawsuit. And there are a few states, including South Carolina, who have an all-white primary. In South Carolina, the only party at this point in time is the Democratic Party, which is really the Republican Party now. There's a flip with the Dixiecrats and all that. But there is an all-white primary, meaning that you can't vote. You're just completely excluded. And so Hinton, for 4 or 5 years, has been trying to get Black people registered to vote so that they can have a lawsuit when they're turned down at the voting booth. So the way they do this is voter books are kept in stores fronts. They're voter registration books, and they would go gather across the street from stores. And the way George Elmore gets involved is they're across the street from the Allen and Benedict campus area, and a store that has a big glass front. And they're watching for the voter registrar to take out her voter registration book, and then they will dash over there and demand to be allowed to sign the book too. So they haven't had any luck with this tactic. No one's gotten able to sign the book yet. But George Elmore sees them. He lives in the area, and he is an entrepreneur. This is his 5 and dime store. He is a photographer. He's going to play into some lynchings later as a photographer. And he walks over, finds out what they're doing, and he says, let me go. And the reason he says, let me go, is because, as you can see, he looks white. So he goes over. The clerk in the store thinks he's white. She pulls out her book and points to those men across the street using horrible words and says, I know what they want to do. You need to vote. You're a white man and you need to vote. And you need to stop them. Sign the book. Have you registered? No. Sign the book. So George Elmore writes his name, and she's like, good, and then she turns the page to get his address, and his address is Height Street, which is a Black street in this segregated neighborhood. She recognizes it, and she says, so you're, and then you insert the word too. Well, go tell your friends to come register. Go ahead, get them over here to register too. And so that's how 6 men who are Black in Columbia register to vote. George Elmore takes his registration and goes to vote, and of course is turned down, and then he sues. Now, this, as I said, this takes a lot of courage. What happens to George Elmore is he wins his lawsuit, and I want to tell you what happens to him, and then I'll tell you about how the lawsuit continues. He cannot get his store stocked. There are so many threats and attacks on his home that his wife has a mental health breakdown and is never well again. He's diabetic, and the stress exacerbates his diabetes, and he dies a few years later. But he says he does not regret this. And his children said he never regretted it, but it was an important thing to do. So what happens with the lawsuit is that they win. And so what does South Carolina do? South Carolina appeals, because this is what South Carolina always does. Think of Shannon Faulkner. They always take it all the way to the Supreme Court because they're not going to let any federal judge tell them what to do. And then they ignore the Supreme Court. So they win. And so George Elmore does manage to vote. I have a beautiful picture of Reverend Hinton lined up to vote. They get to vote, but in the meantime, South Carolina has appealed. And their argument in the appeal is that the Democratic Party is like the Forest Lake Country Club. They really say Forest Lake Country Club. And that it is a private club and it can admit whomever it wants. And the appeals court says, no, democracy, this is a basic right in a democratic government and people can vote. It is not a private club. So what South Carolina does next is it creates a segregation oath. And so for you to vote, they're not going to turn you away, but they will if you don't sign the segregation oath. So they have to sue again. And a man named David Brown sues. South Carolina actually has a federal judge who will figure in what's the beginning of Brown versus Board, Wadey Zwearing, who says, it's time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union. And I will put anybody in jail that violates my order. And he opens the books at the end of July, and tens of thousands of Black Americans in South Carolina registered to vote. And some of them manage to vote because what they do is they assign them limited wards, and most of them can't get in the limited time to vote. And they're standing outside as they close the doors on voting, which should be familiar to you in terms of what we're going to see coming up in voting registration in our current time. So this is another one of my upsetting pictures for you. This is Willie Earl. Willie Earl had been a truck driver. He had epilepsy and had lost his job. And at about the time that he was unemployed, a taxi driver was knifed in Pickens County, and it was hospitalized. And because Willie Earl, the theory is, was noticeable as an epileptic, he was arrested. But the taxi driver who was wounded, so he did die, but he survived a night and another day, and he never described anyone that looked at all like Willie Earl. He never named anyone, but because Willie Earl had been arrested and not charged, and he was accessible in jail, a lynch mob of taxi drivers abducted him from the jail. The jailer let them in and claimed he hadn't. And he was taken to near a Greenville slaughterhouse and killed. And this is one of several pictures. There are pictures that show his mutilated body. I've chosen to show you one where it's been somewhat rebuilt. He was carved up with butcher knives and also shot. So the FBI got involved because this got some publicity. Thurman was governor. He wasn't happy about the FBI coming in, but he also wasn't happy about what he called mob rule. This is our future Senator Strom Thurmond. So the FBI came in, and within 2 days, because people weren't shy about being part of a lynch mob, they saw nothing wrong with it. 30 people are arrested and 26 of them confess. And as you can see from this picture, they're all acquitted. The judge says that their confessions can only be used against themselves, not against anyone else. And so even though they confess, they can't implicate the people who were wielding the knives, and they can't implicate the people who were shooting Mr. Earl. And so the defense doesn't even put up any witnesses. They make speeches, and they say things like, I'm glad Willie Earl is dead. If there was a mad dog in the neighborhood, I'd shoot it too, things like this. And this is an article in the New Yorker by Rebecca West. who had just finished, she became Dame Rebecca West, finished reporting on the Nuremberg trials and was sent to Greenville. And I think what's the most important thing that she says in her article, which you can still find online, thanks to the New Yorker, is that people in Greenville thought of lynching as a social prophylactic. What she means by that is when white people thought Black people were getting, in the vernacular of the time, too uppity, then lynching was good because it exerted their control again. And Ida B. Wells Barnett actually pretty much agreed with this. You may remember her name. She investigated lynchings, and the NAACP and she and the Tuskegee Institute were all keeping count of lynchings. Of the 12 worst states, which are mostly in the South, South Carolina was number 7 in the number of lynchings. And she said it was a way to keep economic and social pressure in the hands of white people by terrorizing Black people by the constant threat of death. So as I said, they're all acquitted. And this is the last of my horrible pictures for you. This is Reverend Archie Ware. So a year after that, he's trying to exercise his right to vote in Abbeville County. When he comes out, he's attacked by men with butcher knives again. And there are pictures of South Caroliniana of the long slices on his thigh and his stomach and the dozens and dozens of stitches putting him back together again. He went to McRae, and McRae wrote a story about him. He's in the clothes that you can see how his jacket's torn and his shirt's bloody. He's put back on the clothes that he was in. There were policemen there who ignored it. The only reason he survived was after the assassins really walked off and the police walked off. His friends got him to a doctor. So he left. There's stories that I read afterwards where people were asked, the sheriff was asked, what's happening with this investigation? And he said, no, he left after he had named everybody. The sheriff said, oh, it could take 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years to figure this out. So of course nothing happened. So to something that's as horrible, but brighter, is more about psychological and educational violence. This is Harry and Eliza Briggs. It's another World War II veteran, Harry, here. This is a photo that Nathan, their son, took for me. So that's why it's a little, because he took it on his phone. But and this is Eliza. They lived in Somerton, South Carolina. And they were the petitioners whose names are Briggs versus Elliott, which is the first of 5 lawsuits that became Brown versus Board of Education. And Harry worked at a gas station. Eliza was a housekeeper for motels. At this point in time, Somerton is on the main route to Florida, and it actually has several motels, and people stop there and buy pecan pies and eat at the restaurants and go maybe spend the night and go on to Florida. So there are some family members, James, Ferdinand, Levi, and Jesse Pearson, who have in the early 40s been trying to get a school bus. And among the things that are absent in Black children's lives is transportation. And there is one school in Somerton that serves all grades, and then these little tiny 1-room schools out in the rural areas. And if you want, there were only like 14 high schools in all of South Carolina at this point in time for Black children. And there were none for Native Americans, who were also confined to segregated schools. And so the children who are going for middle or high school and live in the rural areas, like the Pearson children, are walking 9 miles one day way to get to school. And so the Pearsons have equipped a truck with boards and have driven kids that way. And then they have pooled money with other parents and have bought a school bus that breaks down, and then they buy another school bus that breaks down. And along the way, they're asking over and over again for money for the engines, for the gasoline, and they're being turned down. And Hinton has gone to an NAACP meeting where in the late 30s and early 40s, the NAACP has had several lawsuits attempting to get students into law schools. And they've approached it from the graduate school level because they thought it would be less upsetting to white people if it was young adults who were desegregated. And they have won them through the 14th Amendment, which says that a state can not deny full citizenship rights to its people. And so through the 14th Amendment, they are now ready to test that on public schools. And so Hinton comes back and he agrees that the first way to start might be a school bus. And he demands of a bunch of ministers in Columbia, find me somebody bold enough to ask for a school bus. They ask for a school bus. Pearson sues for that. Because there are multiple school districts and there's a great confusion, which I think is actually faked about whether he's really suing in the right school district. Thurgood Marshall says, and he trusts Hinton, but he says we shouldn't do this lawsuit. And then there is another NAACP national meeting, and Hinton goes to that, and they say we're ready to sue for equal. And so the school systems are separate but equal, and they've decided to start suing for equal. And so these people are the first names on the signature for the petition for equality among the schools. And so what they're asking for is what they call equal everything. They want not just school buses, they want not just school books, but they want buildings with toilets, they want everything that the white children have, which is why they call it equal everything. And so this is a typical school. This is Spring Hill Elementary. And this is Maddie Delane and Helen Richburg. Their husbands are ministers who will be very active in this. And Richburg will be threatened with an abduction, and Delane and Maddie's house will be burned to the ground. Delane will have an assassination attempt against him, and he will be run out of town, out of not only Somerton, but Lake City, and then the entire state of South Carolina as this goes on. But this is the two teachers, and I don't know if you can see how far back this goes, but this is, I've tried to count, it's more than 40 or 50 students here of all grades that are their students. And so this is why they're asking for equal everything. They want the best life for their children, as all parents do. And I wanted you to meet some of the children. This is Bee Brown. Her father and mother signed the petition. Her father, Henry Brown, is a janitor at the white schools. He's also a piano player. He plays in some clubs occasionally. He has his own cotton fields. He is a blacksmith. One of the things to keep in mind about these people is they may have been denied an education, but they are multi-talented people and they understand the Constitution better than the people who are resisting giving them rights. So Bee's father will not let his daughters do any work around white people because of sexual assault issues. And the man he works for would come to visit the house, and Mr. Brown would rush out and talk to him by the car. He didn't want him to ever come near the home and see his daughters. And this is B.B. Delane, Brummett Delane. He grows up to be an educator. His father is Reverend Delane that I mentioned, and he's the child whose house is burned to the ground. And this is the petitioners. So here's Eliza Briggs, and here's Harry Briggs Jr., and here's his dad, Harry Briggs Sr. And so the petitioners and supporters, I should say, because this is Reverend Delane, and he does not sign the petition. The NAACP decides he's such a hot spot that probably his name shouldn't be on the petition. This is Reverend Richburg, and this is Reverend Seals. So Reverend Seals is sort of the right-hand man of Reverend Delane, and his church, St. Mark, is one of the places that they meet often, and petitioners who had gone to St. Mark walk just across the street to the Briggs home to sign the first petition. And he has a hog farm, a rural hog farm. It's going to be burned to the ground. His house is going to be surrounded so often by the KKK that he sends a grandson he's raising and his wife to New York City. Many people have relatives in New York City, Philadelphia, and Chicago, and this is where people go. This is Maisie Solomon and Annie Gibson. They're both sharecroppers, and because their names show up on the petition, they're kicked off their farms. And sharecropper relationships were also often multi-generational and certainly lifetime relationships. So it's a big deal to get kicked off. It means you have nothing. This is Mary Oliver. She and her husband own a cafe in Somerton, and it will now not be supplied by anyone white, and her husband has to go get friends buy stuff that he then stocks his store with. He dies before the second petition, which is the petition that asks for desegregation. And she signs that second petition. And her friends say, why did you do this? This is, so dangerous. And she says, I just love this. She said, I promised my husband I'd be a woman. And so she signs again. And so I could tell you stories like this about every one of these people. They all pay terrible penalties, but they sign again. They sign again. And the second petition is the petition that goes to the Supreme Court to join Kansas, Baltimore, Maryland, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. in what becomes Brown versus Board of Education, and in 1954 desegregates, says that segregation of schools is unconstitutional. In 1955 does a very pallid at whatever speed. And what happens in Somerton is white men surround the school in 1955 with rifles. And so no black student gets in until the very late 60s, when this man's daughter, with the help of the Justice Department, because all her teachers have put Fs on all her A tests and thrown away her books, graduates, Shirley McDonald. So I'm almost out of time here and talking to you about faces, but I'm going to zoom through here. I didn't want to neglect white people. Here we have the White Citizens Council, which forms in 55 after the Brown Act. This is the first state meeting. You can see it's called the KKK in Business Times. You can see why. This is Governor Burns, who was governor at the time. He's attending the statewide meeting. He's sitting next to Strom Thurmond's wife, Jean Crouch Strawman. And I have a photograph of Strom Thurmond on the stage because he's going to address these men, because they're copacetic. They're all in agreement that, as Burns says, this is a white man's country and will always remain a white man's country. And the White Citizens Council furthers what the KKK has been doing with what they call the squeeze or freeze, which is they deny loans, they deny mortgages, they don't sell farmers feed and seed, everything that they can do to make it almost impossible for you to live. And so this is actually a story of South Carolina too, because people either are so brave and so fierce like Hinton that they stay through it all, or they leave. And everybody I tracked down who left is an enormous success. It's a true brain drain. This is the KKK on the State House grounds in 1957. If you were Black and you set foot on the State House grounds at University of South Carolina, you would be arrested for loitering. And yet the KKK had just had a march up and down Main Street, formed what they called a human cross on the State House grounds. Here's George Washington with them. And here's the Women's Auxiliary, who are called the Ladies of the Camellia. And this is Mr. McCain. And so when the sit-ins start, he is one of the most important people in the sit-ins. And I hope you're gathering here that South Carolina, while it may have been under the radar in the history books because of propaganda and censorship, is really important to the civil rights movement. He is the man who teaches everybody nonviolent direct action. He's been fired from 2 jobs for belonging to the NAACP and supporting Briggs versus Elliott, and has become a field secretary for the Congress of Racial Equality. Congress of Racial Equality is a biracial group that formed in Chicago from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Fellowship of Reconciliation formed in World War I with conscientious objectors. Many of the core white and Black organizers are ministers who actually go to prison during World War II rather than fight. And Mr. McCain is their first Black field secretary, although it's a biracial group. It's been based in the North and has been doing sit-ins since the 1940s. He's the first field secretary for the South. He's been focused on voter registration, but now he starts teaching nonviolent direct action. So nonviolent direct action does not come from Martin Luther King. It comes from Gandhi in the 30s and 40s. These people, including James Lawson, who became very famous for his activism in Nashville, go to India and they study with Gandhi and then his heirs. And what they learn is called satyagraha, which is loosely translated in the US as soul power. And Gandhi teaches it is not passive, it's very active. You must not assault back, but you must do everything you can to radiate love and your humanity so that your opponent will see you as a human being. And he believed that, and I guess he was an example of this, that it could take just one, but one could make for thousands. And of course, with the Salt March to the Sea, which was participated in by tens of thousands of people from India, he defeated the British Empire. And so it is a core minister, a white minister named Glenn Smiley, who goes to Montgomery and persuades Martin Luther King not to have a bodyguard and to get rid of the guns. There are guns everywhere. And to address all of this through nonviolent direct action. And then the students do. Now think of being 17, 18, 19, and you go in and you sit down at a lunch counter, someone throws ketchup on you, tosses ammonia bombs at you, knocks you off a stool, and you don't respond in kind. So this is Reverend Cecil Augustus Ivory in Rock Hill. He's an ally of the students who's wheelchair bound, and he dies young because he stays in his wheelchair until he gets terrible sores. But he organizes the very first sit-in South Carolina in Rock Hill, February 12th. These are some of the kids that greet the Black protesters. This person is going to go on to beat up Senator Lewis, who was not, at this point in time, is a participant in the Freedom Rides in 1961. And before his death a few years ago, before Senator Lewis's death, he went to apologize. And Lewis said no individual had ever apologized to him before. So he said he had been a bad man and he wanted to make peace with God before he died. This guy is going to throw raw eggs at the protesters. This is Thomas Gaither, who is going to come up with the Freedom Ride idea. He's a Claflin student. This is Julie Wright, who's going to work with Medgar Evers, who's murdered in 1963 in Mississippi. She's NAACP, he's CORE, but as you can see, they are friends. His tie says, Jim Crow must go. He becomes a young CORE field secretary, and he's on a bus with Gordon McRae, who had worked with Mr. McCain. And the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the 40s had done a very abbreviated freedom ride called the Journey of Reconciliation. He says, let's do it again. And he becomes the scout for the freedom rides. This is, during the sit-ins, what some of the stores would do. They've taken down all the seats. So what happens is many of the stores go bust because their white customers can't come in and eat. And the reason they can't come in and eat is because they won't let anybody that's Black sit with them. So the places shut down or remove their seats or put plants and other things on their counters and don't operate as lunch counters anymore. So I should probably remind you, it's not just about lunch counters. You couldn't go into a theater. You couldn't go to a fair. You couldn't go to a park. You couldn't go to a beach. As I mentioned, you couldn't step on USC's grounds. You couldn't step on the State House grounds. You couldn't go to City Hall. Segregation was all-encompassing. This is Chuck McDew. He's a football player whose father went to SC State. He grows up in desegregated Ohio, comes down in the first semester. He goes to Sumter to have Thanksgiving with some friends, and he gets arrested 3 times in 2 days. He's driving. He's converted to Judaism because white churches won't let him in, but synagogues will. He is driving because he's the one who doesn't drink from a party. The police stop him. When a policeman objects to him not saying yes, sir, constantly, he's been on an all-Black campus. He doesn't know how it works in the South. And he says, you've got to be jibing me. And so the police beat him, break his arm and his jaw. On his way back to campus, his parents bail him out and tell him, get back to campus and don't leave. He refuses to sit in the baggage car. Trains are segregated. They will put you in the baggage car if they don't have an all-Black car. He gets arrested again. When he does finally make it to campus, he cuts across a park. It's a white-only park, and he gets arrested again. And he decides he's got to get out of South Carolina while he's still alive. And instead, he ends up being the leader of the South Carolina State students, not Representative Clyburn, Chuck McDew, and becomes the second leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is the national group of Black students who join with white students for Freedom Summer in Mississippi. This is Dee Dee Wright in Greenville. I thought you might want to see that that Black women were also very active in the sit-ins. She was trying to desegregate buses because they didn't have school buses. They had to ride the city buses to get to school in Greenville, and she's arrested for constantly insisting on sitting at the front of the bus. She's been arrested here for trying to desegregate the Greenville Library with someone whose name you'll remember, Jesse Jackson. This is Lenny Glover. He's a World War II veteran who, with David Carter, is one of the leaders in the Columbia sit-ins. He's in Woolworth and gets stabbed. He drives himself to the Black-only hospital, which is from downtown about 3 miles to near Hardin Street, almost dies on the operating table because he'd been stabbed in the spleen. As soon as he's been stitched up, he gets back out to picket. The store bears the blood of Lenny Glover. And this is the hospital strike in 1969, which was the biggest event in the civil rights movement and pretty much considered the last one. The women of 400 Black women strike. And I wanted you to see this picture. I want you to see this sweet face here. Their children picket with them. McNair sends tanks with armed soldiers. They have bayonets on their rifles. Their rifles are loaded to defend the state against these 400 women and their children. They are asking for what they call human dignity and a human wage. They're not paid the minimum wage. The hospital is still segregated. There are no Black nurses, there are no Black doctors. There was a joke in Charleston that no Black person went crazy because the mental health facility didn't accept anybody Black at all. They have no bathrooms until 65. Now keep in mind the Civil Rights Act of 64 requires equal opportunity and desegregation of facilities that get federal money, and this hospital does get federal money. So they strike the what's called the Medical College Hospital and the Charleston County Hospital for several months. And this is the local leader. This is Doris Turner with 1199, which is the New York City union that comes to join them. This is Mary Moultrie, beautiful voice, becomes the spokesperson and travels all over the country raising tens of thousands of dollars to support the strike. Coretta Scott King is a widow now. She comes to support them. And this is her venture out of widowhood. And this is Rosetta Simmons, who is the representative from the Charleston County. And the women don't get entirely what they want. They do get minimum wage, and we owe them a debt of gratitude because South Carolina's state agencies were run as private fiefdoms. There was not a pay scale, there was not promotion ladder, and because of their demands that happens, but they don't actually get a lasting union. Mary Moultrie goes on to be a park leader in Charleston, and Rosetta continues nursing, but as a private nurse. And the reason for that is although they get their jobs back, they are hounded so that Mary actually becomes ill and they have to leave their jobs. So last picture, a little more celebratory than some that I've showed you. This is the Mother's Day March. 15,000 people coming from all over the country to support these women. Here's Rosetta again, Rosetta Simmons. This is Walter Reuther with the United Auto Workers. He said, we're gonna jack McNair into the 20th century in the speech. This is Mary Moultrie. This is Ralph Abernathy, his wife Juanita. And this is Reverend Joseph Lowry and his wife Evelyn. The guy in the white is a ranger. They were sort of a protection squad. They wore white, they rode white horses. They're from Chicago. Jesse Jackson sent them down to support the strikers. So I hope what you gather here is these are real people who did very brave things. They were all ages, they were all walks of life, but they have been enormously limited in their opportunities by the entrenched white supremacy. And it was not easy finding their stories because the white newspapers, white-owned newspapers, often didn't write about these things. For example, 3,000 ministers in 1956 went to pray on the Orangeburg Green. It was not in the Orangeburg paper. I think of that. You go downtown, there are 3,000 people praying on the green. You get your paper the next day, there's nothing there. The state paper barely covered the Charleston hospital strike. So the Philadelphia Courier, the Afro-American paper, people like Cecil Williams, who's a local photographer, that's how the media, I find media stories, and then archives, and then talking to people who actually did participate. Chuck McDew is a wonderful storyteller. Mary Moultrie, I know how beautiful her voice was because I talked to her. So there are people that I met and talked to at length to preserve their stories. And again, it just bothered me so much that people would not know how incredible these humans were. And of course, they're doing it for everybody. They're not just doing it for a race. They're doing it to make this a country that actually abides by its constitutional promises. So I really hope you have some questions for me.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudia. That was really extraordinary history. So, Gail, I think we could probably just unmute folks and let them ask their questions. Gail did have a question about how do these schools compare to the corridor of shame situation?
Now, I put the Abbeville story in my conclusion because when that went to trial, the judge said race couldn't be considered. And of course it compares. You know, one of the schools was built in 1895. A tower loaded with bat guano crashed onto a principal's desk. What happened with is that South Carolina not only resisted desegregation until 1970-71, when Judge Hemphill in Greenville said, okay, I agree with HEW, no money. And while most of the school funding is state, there is a substantial amount of federal money. And so gradually at that point, schools started desegregating. But what happened was something, I'm not gonna get the number right, hundreds of segregation academies popped up all over the South and in South Carolina. And so what happened in counties that were heavily African-American, white people deserted the schools, and then the schools decayed. And oftentimes white people were still running the school boards too. Mm-hmm. So that's how you get schools that are horribly underfunded and underachieving. I see in chat, how long was this book in the works? 20 years. It's a thrill to be able to talk to you about it, because I didn't talk about the book with people because I knew they'd say, oh yeah, wow, she's been working on that forever. She's gonna die and it's still gonna be in her closet, Because I would work during my time off. I would work on a weekend. If my kids had soccer games or something, I might go to the soccer game, or I might be at home working on the book. I moved to Columbia College thinking, well, academics write books, but I didn't think about the fact that I was teaching writing and I was going to be reading other people's really, really bad writing rather than working on my book. So it took me a long time to get it done. And it was terrifying that it took so long, because a lot of the people that I'd interviewed were elderly and they were dying. They weren't going to see the book, which made me feel really
Oops. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask Claudia a question, go ahead, free to do that.
I see another in chat about the Sims book. I've got it. His daughter, Mary Oliphant Sims, can continue the book. And so it was used into I think the late 70s. And the version I have, she praises the KKK. They're noble.
Wondering if you could tell us about what's being taught to children in school these days. Are these stories being taught? Is your book being used in any classrooms?
The book just came out in November. I hope at some point it will be something that might be assigned as reading. But I think you probably also know that the conservative movement is trying to outlaw critical race theory and entrench as law teaching what they call patriotic history. And the objection here is that it's not patriotic to acknowledge that we interned the Japanese, we had the Trail of Tears for the Native Americans, we denied the vote to Black citizens. So I don't know what's going to happen with us knowing our history. And the question for me is, how can you do better if you didn't know what was going on before? Because I think you need to know what was going on before to know how to approach doing better. I think that's true, you know, at a basic level, like just with parenting, you know, that you need to be fully informed to be able to move on and do better. And we're not fully informed. And I do not lightly use the words propaganda and censorship. I think they really existed.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think other states, and particularly deep South states, have stories very similar to this?
Oh, of course. The reason, you know, for example, let me do something really fast. Mississippi, South Carolina. Okay. So you know about fire hoses in Mississippi because the national media went down, not because the local media was covering it, but the national media went down. And then Edmund Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis got a concussion. You know about that because there was a national TV. They put the film on an airplane and got it up to New York, and it went on broadcast. So that's how we know about Mississippi. In South Carolina, and on March 15, 1960, there were more than 1,000 students who were walking toward the square in Orangeburg, and they were stopped in freezing weather with high fire hoses and tear gas. The picture went all around the world of them locked up outside, wet in this freezing weather. But the local papers didn't write about it, you know. So I think when we think about reading national stories, you know, you have we have some big books, you know, some big books that talk about Freedom Summer or talk about Bull Connor, but we don't have. I think the word's granular. We don't have these drilled down stories many places, and for me, I'd be interested if whether you agree. I'm really tired of great white men history. And I don't think they ever did it all by themselves. You know, I mean, Winston Churchill is a great man. Abraham Lincoln's a great man, but they didn't do it by themselves, right? They didn't just manifest and change the world. And so, and I feel this way as a woman too, in terms of women's history. We need to know how people like Hinton or B. Brown, that little girl you saw, how they got up in the morning and they said, I'm doing it today. You know, I'm looking for that petitioner. I'm going to sit on the lunch counter seat, or I'm really scared to sit on the lunch counter seat. I'm just going to go to the church basement and write some signs, but I'm still going to make a difference. How did they do that so that we can do it too? So I think it's really important to know the whole story. And because then we can say, I don't have to be Abraham Lincoln, I can still make a difference. And I do think that there's a movement toward that, you know, in the books that we have access to in, say, maybe the last 15 years. I mentioned maybe before we started Thavolia Glimpse. She was a professor at USC that's now at UNC. And there are a couple of white woman historians who were famous for writing about plantation women, and particularly plantation women when their men were off during the Civil War and they were managing hundreds of enslaved people. And these books bothered her, and she went down to the sources, which were the diaries. And there in the diaries are these incredible tortures that the white women inflicted on their Black house servants and their field servants, trying to keep control. Things like you didn't say yes ma'am right and you got hit in the head with a poker. There were instruments that would block your mouth. So she went and did a book called Out of the House of Bondage, where she's gone back and she looked at something other historians looked at, but she looked at it with different eyes and collected material that was already there, but had not been, you know, brought forth to the rest of us. So I think that will happen too, that people will go back with different eyes and ears and look at things again.
Claudia. And I think what you're saying is so important because I grew up in Batesburg, Leesville, South Carolina. I am very familiar with the Linwood Shoal incident and the horror of that. It was a cautionary tale for my family. My family were educators. My mother was a high school chemistry and physics teacher. My maternal grandfather, Frederick Hampton Hendricks, wrote to the Sears Foundation in the late 1930s. He died in 1940, trying to secure funds for the first separate but equal elementary school in Leesville, South Carolina. It bore his name, the F. Hampton Hendricks Elementary School, until consolidation in the 1980s. I am very thankful. My grandparents' house was next to a home that had markings on the chimney to designate it as a meeting place for the Klan.
Wow.
So my mother was surrounded with that. And I'm very thankful that the family saw education as a way to overcome that. But you're so right, the education has to have the facts on both sides, because we did have that very misogynistic, heavy-handed white male society. And coming out of that was a struggle all the way around. I married a man from the Midwest when his mother realized we had identified with help, the Black cook growing up, we had a maid. She was aghast and thought I would think less of people who had been domestics. What she didn't understand was that was some of the only safe employment that Black women could have in small Southern towns. It was not perfect, but the interaction that I grew up with women, Black women caring for me, certainly colored, no pun intended, colored my view of the humanity of those families. They were one-on-one, just like us.
Thomas Gaither said something interesting when you said the word humanity. He was the young Corps secretary from Claflin University. He said that when a well-dressed young student sat down with their Bible or their school book at a lunch counter, and people saw on TV or they saw in a photograph, white people leaning over, screaming at them, he said that you would have to understand that we were working on a high moral plane. I love that phrase, high moral plane. And we were only asking to be seen as a human being.
That's it. And
yeah,
churches were so very important, even in our small community, because they were the center for the Black families, politically, morally, educationally. It's what they had. It's all they had. There was so much denied to them otherwise.
Cecil was threatened with the draft because he took a picture that went internationally too, of two Black students knocking on the door of the church the mayor went to, and the mayor is barring the door to the church. And so it's their backs and then the mayor facing them.
Wow.
And, he said a week later he was called into the draft board, and as the woman pulled his file out to tell him that his student exemption was now gone, this picture fell out. The picture fell out. So he knew exactly why he had been called in.
I grew up very near the Edgefield County, where Strom Thurmond, that, families very entrenched. I was surrounded by that growing up. And I'm very thankful for family influence that had educators in it. Not that other people were incapable. I don't mean that at all. But we worked very hard to always make sure we understood both sides.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do when you're isolated.
Yeah. Gail, were you going to say something?
Well, it occurs to me that many of my African-American friends who had lived up north in the Midwest, whatever, and would come back, and I'd say to them, why? Because I'd grown up in Chicago and I hadn't seen, right? I hadn't seen the segregation and the abuse and the torture. And they would say, because at least I know here who's doing what to whom. And the more that I've learned about all these northern communities, it's different ways of doing it. But there's not a whole lot more freedom in those settings.
Yeah.
Yeah, Thurgood Marshall's number 2 guy was Robert Carter, who ended up a federal judge, and he felt very strongly that NAACP needed to be paying attention to urban segregation earlier than it did.
Yeah.
And of course, urban segregation also leads to education segregation, right?
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
And I can think of Black student contemporaries that I knew, again, going to separate schools, but to have any opportunity, the family sent them away to family in the Chicago area or other places, so for the chance for a better education and the job market afterwards, because things were so limited in the South for so long.
well,
I grew up very much
until
with
the,
separate but equal, which was never equal.
there were high schools. You couldn't get a
No.
higher education if you were Black. As I said, there were like 14 in the 40s. And so many parents did send their children to board with relatives where there was the high school in the state, or you did go out of state. Mary Moultrie, for example, went to New York City upon graduating from high school and got licensing as a practical nurse and worked at the Roosevelt Hospital in New York City. And was making $4 an hour. But then her mother got really ill. She was the oldest daughter. She came back to nurse her mother, and she got hired at the Medical College Hospital at 70 cents an hour, and they wouldn't recognize her credentials. Yeah. So one of the things that struck me as a baby reporter, you know, when I was first starting to think about this is, I still don't quite know how to express it, but it's sort of a cut off your nose to spite your face. It's worse than that, but people need to lift all boats, right? And so how if you think about people's selfishness, don't understand that their racist attitudes are having consequences for them too, you know, that their education is not fully funded.
I can
that their
remember
employees are not fully educated.
Oh, I can remember the frustration with, as I mentioned, with the separate but equal school, but my mother's total frustration saying, but they have no books, they don't get funding. Once they're in the building, they don't get funding. They got all the secondhand books, the out-of-date books, the things. So how can you possibly be given the same opportunity? You're not.
Yeah. During Abbeville v. South Carolina, and I have just a few examples of this, but I went to the trial, and it was the same situation. So in separate but equal, they got the only school books they were provided were the discards. So they might be missing pages, you know, they might be way out of date. They might have nasty things scribbled in them. In Abbeville, South Carolina, there was still that situation. There were libraries where they had books that were saying someday we'll get on the moon. Okay.
Right. And
so it was horrifying. There was a child who brought a dead bat for the letter B, because that was what was available. The biology class, they were having to go out and collect dead animals because they had not the income for the supplies to be doing the biology work that they needed to do. So the schools were still dreadfully underfunded, and it has directly to do with race. In Somerton, Scotch Branch High School has a competitor, I guess you'd say, which is Clarendon Hall. Clarendon Hall is a SEG Academy. Scotts Branch High School is 96% Black, and Clarendon Hall is 96% white.
Mhm.
And so what do you think happens in terms of school support and things like that? It's still
Exactly.
segregated.
Exactly. And the
So-
courses that are offered, it's just really interesting.
So, does anyone else have a question? I have one, but I'd like to give everyone else an opportunity. The hour is getting late. Anyone? Claudia, I know this is asking you to have a crystal ball, but given the state of things in the current political environment in the last several years, do you see parallels? I don't think, hopefully we'll never go back to what existed before, but do you see in the next few years a lot of strife regarding civil rights again?
Well, we're seeing it right now, right? We're seeing, if you think of North Carolina and Virginia and Texas, for example, Florida, we're seeing,
Entrenchment.
remember the Texas Democrats went up to the Capitol and then they got arrested. We're seeing legislatures that are trying to abridge rights. The Georgia laws where you couldn't give water. Think how hot South Carolina is. You're lined up outside for a city primary in the summer, which
No water.
happens. And someone's going to get arrested if they offer you any water. Or on the Native American reservations, they're trying to stop the collecting of votes where people live hundreds of miles from the facilities that they might use for registering, and they may not even have a functioning car. They live off the grid, and so it's very important to have someone that's going and collecting their absentee ballots. They don't have a postman knocking on the door, and so all those efforts to limit voting are, it seems to me, not just political, but very much racial. And I would encourage you all to read about race. I think because I lived in the Japanese culture from 6 to 10 years old, I just started thinking about it really young. And I think it's 100% social construct. I remember a National Geographic article that said, look at noses instead. The long, narrow nose means you're a northerner. That's me. And the short, broader nose means you are in a tropical climate. You can look at it that way. That there's a book by Nell Painter, who is an academic who now actually does paint, but she wrote a book I think it might be called White People, but it's really interesting to read, because one of the ways she argues whiteness came about was that there was in the Mediterranean Sea, there was a lot of piracy. Remember Venice and Morocco were sort of competing in the oceans, and there was enslavement. There were beautiful women being enslaved, and the women of the Caucasus were considered the most beautiful slaves. This is the mountains near Russia. And that's where Caucasian comes from. And that the absolute whiteness was the collection of Roman statues. The Greeks painted those beautiful statues. The Romans copied them, and they copied them white because the paint was all fading. And that this whiteness was considered the ultimate in beauty. And so she traces this way that white became the white that we know, that is considered superior in a variety of ways. And it is just embarrassing how stupid it is. It really is. I recommend a couple of those books so you can start thinking about, does this exist at all, or does it exist in the way that we have forced it to exist by denying people education and resources, so that we can, if we are white, look down on them, and if we are another color, actually question ourselves because of all that we've been taught about these bizarre ideas, a sort of brainwashing.
And it's amazing how much of it also, Claudia, can be a bit regional, because I mentioned I married a man from the Midwest. His experience, he didn't even see a Black person until he went into the Navy in boot camp. So his struggle was being an immigrant, third generation Norwegian. They all, everybody was white and blue-eyed, but the Swedes didn't like the Norwegians, It's amazing how much of that regionality comes in there too.
Yeah, but then you have in the Midwest and the upper North, you have the discrimination against Native Americans. And
Yeah.
in the earlier part of the country, you had discrimination against Asians who were brought in to do the railroads and the hard work.
Further
in
west,
California.
yes.
There are lawsuits. Gong Lung was one of the lawsuits they used to justify discrimination. This was a Chinese immigrant who wanted his daughter to send to white school, and they said, "You're not white."
Nope.
In South Carolina with Native Americans, there were a handful of, we don't have a reservation here because South Carolina pretty much wiped out tribal lands, but we do have a couple of remnants of tribes, and they had segregated elementary schools.
Yeah.
And so, there's always somebody to pick on. And the book White Fragility has a great story in the beginning about Italians and Irish were not considered white when they first came.
I can remember Irish grant. Yep.
Yeah, and so I'm not going to get this exactly right, but she talks about how after she does her lectures, angry white people come up and say things that, about, I only got what I earned, that kind of thing, And that this guy comes up and says, well, we were Italian and we were discriminated against and we were told we weren't white. Well, we're white and we're white now and everybody thinks we're white. And she said what she wants to ask when that sort of conversation starts is, how'd you get white?
Yeah.
Tell me how that happened.
Yeah. How'd you get that? When did that happen? Yeah.
Yeah.
Justification. If people will quit trying to justify everything, just be,
I do think that, going back to your question, Joanne, I think there are many younger people that think differently. And the census, we'll learn more about it now, but more and more people are identifying as multiple races. Now, some of that may be those DNA tests, but some of it also is the two generations under us who didn't accept what their parents perhaps were teaching them and have married across races. And I remember, do you remember the senior George Bush getting in trouble? He has Hispanic grandchildren. And he said something about one of my little brown grandchildren, and everybody went, ah! But that's happening. Not everybody, the white people. That's happening across generations where people are actually kind of interested, I heard a really kind of funny joke about this, about ancestry.com, where people go to get their DNA, and it was a Black comedian, and he said, you white people, don't come up to me and say, I'm 1% Bantu. I get it, man. He said, you have no idea
No way.
what you're talking about.
I have a question, and I know we need to wrap this up. We've kept you long enough, but Jean Prothro wanted to know, how long was the book in the works? Our 7th grade history book was History of South Carolina by William Gilmore Simms, and some of my classmates still insist that the cause of the Civil War were tariffs levied against the Southern cotton industry.
Cotton industry, yeah.
Well, there's opinion and then there's fact. That's one of the things I had to work on with my students, what is a fact? What is a fact? This book took me forever. I started thinking of it as a book in 2003, and it got published in November of 2020. It took me a really, really long time. And that was upsetting to me because I wanted the people who talked to me to have the book, and some of them didn't.
Yeah.
Did not get to see it.
It was one of those things where I was working full-time, single parent, and I did it as I could, as much as I could, which meant, weekends and holidays. Two of the happiest moments with this book are Reverend Hinton's grandchildren and great-grandchildren had a Zoom with me, and Reverend Ivory, who I glossed over, who was just a wonderful person. His daughter still lives, and I did a Zoom with their family. So that made me really happy that, to be able to pass on to other generations what noble people they had descended from. And I hope I'll have more opportunities like that. And that's the strange part of the book now is I really, really, really want these stories out. I hope you will tell your friends. I have a great website, storiesofstruggle.com, where you can go see more. I will go to anybody's book club, tell your other friends that are in different book clubs. I want people, it's not ego, it's not read my book, it's I want you to know Reverend Hinton. I want you to know the kind of person he was. I want you to know Reverend Ivory. I want you to know some of the women I haven't talked about, like May Frances Moultrie Howard, who decided to stay in jail, which was a really, really scary thing initially, stay in jail by herself. Just incredible, incredible people.
Well, we have really enjoyed this, and we are so grateful that you agreed to spend so much time with us. And we definitely will spread the word.
Thank you.
About the book. And we also have recorded, because I know there were several people who asked us to record because they had other commitments and couldn't make this time. And I know that they will really enjoy hearing this session. And I think I'm so glad we have it, because I may replay. There was a lot in there, and I don't remember it all, but I would like to. So, and the book is wonderful. So we will definitely spread the word.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and listening to me.
It was absolutely enlightening. Anything else, Gail? Yeah, just inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, everyone, have a good rest of the day. And again, get the book if you haven't. It's a hard read, but it's a great read. So
Well, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, kind of like Just Mercy or the